There was a phrase you'd hear in kitchens all across America in 1955, whispered between a mother and her grown daughter over coffee that had gone cold. You made your bed. Not cruel, exactly. Not even unkind. Just final. Behind that phrase sat something almost nobody talked about out loud. How many marriages in that decade were quietly, completely broken, and how many families made the decision, together without ever holding a meeting about it, to bury that fact so deep that even the children sometimes never knew. This isn't a story about scandal. It's a story about why silence, back then, felt like love. Setting the scene, America after the war. To understand the secret, you have to understand the pressure that created it. By the early 1950s, the United States had built an entire culture around the idea of the happy home. Magazines like Ladies' Home Journal ran columns instructing wives on how to greet him at the door after work. Church attendance was climbing. The suburbs, Levittown, and the hundreds of towns that copied its blueprint were selling something bigger than houses. They were selling a picture of permanence. A marriage wasn't just a private relationship. It was a household's credit rating, a family's standing at church, a woman's entire economic safety net. Divorce existed, but it carried a weight that's hard to imagine now. A divorced woman in a town of 5,000 people wasn't just talked about. She was recalculated. Neighbors reassessed her. Some churches quietly withdrew invitations. And so families developed something like a survival instinct. When a marriage failed, you didn't fix it in public. You managed it in private, sometimes for decades. Let's walk through how that secrecy actually worked, the specific customs, phrases, and quiet arrangements that let so many broken marriages hide in plain sight. 1. The nervous condition. If a wife in 1954 seemed distant, exhausted, or was seen crying in her car outside the A&P, the explanation offered to neighbors was almost always the same. She was having a nervous condition. It was a catch-all phrase, vague enough to explain almost anything, and it was often the family's first line of defense. A husband's drinking, an affair, a marriage gone cold. All of it could be folded into that one soft, medical-sounding phrase, which asked no follow-up questions and invited none. 2. Separate bedrooms, same address. Many couples who had stopped being a couple in any real sense simply stayed. They moved into separate bedrooms, sometimes explained as being for his snoring or her nerves, and continued attending the same church pew, the same Rotary dinners, the same PTA meetings. Did you know that in several 1950s etiquette guides, hosting couples were specifically instructed never to ask how married people were getting along? It was considered as rude as asking about someone's income. That unspoken rule gave unhappy couples an entire social shield. 3. The family council in the kitchen. Before a family let a secret out even to relatives, there was often something like an informal council, usually the wife's mother, sometimes an aunt, gathered at the kitchen table. Not to fix the marriage, to agree together on the story that would be told. Who would know? What would be said if anyone asked? A returning soldier from Korea might come home changed, distant, drinking more than he used to, and the family's response wasn't confrontation. It was construction, building a story sturdy enough to hold. 4. Working late as a universal cover. A husband's absence, whether from a second job, a drinking habit, or another woman entirely, was almost always folded into the same explanation. He was working late. It's a small phrase, but it did enormous work. It protected the children from questions they weren't ready for. It protected the wife from having to explain something she barely understood herself. And it protected the neighborhood's image of the family, which mattered more than we often admit today. 5. The letters that were never sent. Marriage counselors barely existed as a profession in most American towns before the late 1950s. Instead, women wrote letters, long, aching letters to sisters, to old friends from high school, sometimes never mailed at all, just written and folded into a drawer. These letters, when they surfaced today in estate sales and attics, read like confessions to no one. A woman in rural Indiana describing a marriage gone silent, addressed to a sister 3 states away, sealed but never sent, because sending it would have made it real. 6. Children enlisted as keepers of the peace. Perhaps the hardest part of the story is how often children became, without ever being told directly, the family's quiet diplomats. An eldest daughter might learn, without a single conversation about it, never to mention daddy's temper in front of grandma. A son might learn to answer, "Everything's fine," reflexively, the way you'd say, "You're welcome." These weren't lies children were taught to tell. They were silences children learned to keep, the way you learn to duck under a low doorway after hitting your head on it once. 7. The Sunday performance. Church was often the stage where the family's secret had to hold up under the brightest light. A couple who hadn't spoken a real sentence to each other in weeks would sit together in the same pew, sing the same hymn, and shake the same hands afterward. Did you know some ministers of the era kept private, unofficial notes on which families in their congregation were struggling, specific enough to guide who got invited to quiet visits, but rarely specific enough to name what the struggle actually was? The performance of togetherness was, in many towns, taken as seriously as the marriage itself. 8. The second bank account. For women trapped in marriages they couldn't safely leave, legally, financially, or socially, a quiet, almost invisible act of self-preservation emerged, the hidden household account. A little cash set aside from the grocery budget, a few dollars here and there, kept not for spending, but for the unbearable someday when she might need to leave. Banks in the era rarely allowed a married woman to open an account without her husband's signature, so this money often lived somewhere else entirely: a coffee can, a hollowed-out book, a hat box on the highest closet shelf. 9. The doctor who knew everything and said nothing. Family doctors in small towns occupied a strange, trusted position. They saw the bruises explained as clumsiness. They heard the exhaustion in a wife's voice during an ordinary checkup. And in an era before mandatory reporting laws, before domestic violence had any real legal framework, many of these doctors made a private, personal choice to say nothing directly, instead offering a tonic, a rest cure, a gentle suggestion to take it easier, while quietly documenting far more than they ever spoke aloud. 10. The divorce that became a trip. When a marriage did finally, unavoidably end, families often needed a cover story sturdy enough to survive years of scrutiny. A wife might simply be described as having gone to stay with her sister for an extended visit, sometimes for a year, sometimes longer, while the actual legal process unfolded quietly in another state, since several states offered faster or more discreet divorce proceedings than a person's home state did. By the time she returned, if she returned to that town at all, the story had already calcified into fact. 11. The wedding ring that stayed on. Some women, even years after a marriage had legally ended, continued wearing their wedding ring in public, not out of denial, but out of protection. A ring meant fewer questions at the market, fewer unwanted advances, fewer whispered theories at the beauty parlor. It was a small piece of costume that let a woman move through her town without becoming its newest subject of conversation. 12. The aunt who never married. Family trees from this era are full of quiet edits. An aunt remembered as having never married, when in fact she had, briefly, painfully, and in a courthouse 3 counties over that no one back home ever mentioned again. These weren't malicious lies. They were mercy, of a kind, an entire generation deciding that some chapters simply didn't need to be reread out loud. 13. The ministers, not the marriage, got the blame. When counseling did happen, it was often framed carefully, not as "our marriage is failing," but as "we're going to talk to pastor about some things." The language avoided the word problem almost entirely. Struggles were spoken of the way weather was spoken of, something happening around a family, rarely something happening within it. 14. The photograph that told a different story. Family photo albums from the era are their own quiet archive of performance. A couple who'd barely spoken that week would stand shoulder to shoulder for a Christmas photograph, smiling exactly the amount a Christmas photograph required. Decades later, grandchildren flipping through those albums often have no idea the smiling faces they're looking at were, in some cases, mid-collapse. Why the silence ran so deep? None of this happened because people in the 1950s were less loving, less honest, or less capable of pain than we are now. It happened because the entire architecture of the era, Economic, religious, social, made honesty dangerous in a way it simply isn't for most families today. A woman who admitted her marriage was failing risked her housing, her reputation, sometimes her custody of her own children. A man who admitted the same risked his standing at the company where he'd worked for 20 years. Silence wasn't cowardice. In many cases, it was the only tool available. And there's something tender, even now, in realizing how much love went into that silence. A mother helping her daughter build a cover story not to deceive the world, but to protect her from it. A child learning to say everything's fine, not because they were being dishonest, but because they understood, in the wordless way children understand things, that this was how they helped carry the weight. We live in a different era now, one that, for all its own complications, allows people to speak more openly about the marriages that don't survive. But if your own mother or grandmother lived through this, if you ever noticed a strange gap in the family story, a relative who never married, an aunt who took a long, unexplained trip, you are likely brushing up against exactly this kind of quiet, protective secret-keeping. Not a scandal, a shield. If this story reminded you of someone in your own family, a mother, a grandmother, an aunt whose real story only came out much later, if it ever came out at all, we'd love for you to share it in the comments. These stories deserve to be remembered, gently and honestly, by the people who still carry them. And if you enjoyed spending this time with us, consider staying a while longer. There are more stories from this era waiting to be told.